Chapter 4 Speculative Pragmatism. How Matter Comes to Matter. Toward the end of the monadology, Leibniz writes, "In this system, bodies act as if there were no souls, to assume an impossibility, and souls act as if there were no bodies, and both act as if each influenced the other. The soul and the body belonging to the individual each acts according to its own laws, final causes, the principles of grace, and efficient causes, the laws of nature, respectively, while agreeing perfectly with the actions of the other. Yet the as if is precisely what distinguishes pre-established harmony from Malebranche's occasionalism and Spinoza's parallelism, whereas the latter doctrines merely replace the problem of the union of body and soul. Leibniz puts it at the center of his metaphysics of substance and makes it all the more urgent. There are bodily mechanisms and there are spiritual automata. But if they cannot act on one another directly, what makes them run and how are they attuned? How to conjoin liberty with inner, complete, and pre-established determination. There is activity everywhere, but how is it distributed if its centers of gravity are not localized in the souls of individual actors alone? If the Baroque is like a total theatre staging machines and marionettes, each of which incarnates the play according to its specific technical capacity and aesthetic expressivity, then what guides the hand of the puppeteer who makes puppets do what they do? For Leibniz, the harmony of the as if is a matter of faith, but the general indirection of forces also demands a systematic program for the communication of points of view. Grace, after all, is a schizophrenic machine producing inclusive disjunctions, an infinite movement that feeds on distance and must be passed on through a concatenation of gestures and postures allotted in such a way that it no longer matters who is the subject and what is the object. By revoking the Cartesian dualism of two equal substances into a hierarchy of unaccountable individual substances, Leibniz transforms the relation of soul and body into relations between monads and composites of monads respectively. Their difference is not between two kinds of substances, but between two ways of distributing the world. Souls are taken distributively and constitute eternal individual unities, each every. Bodies are taken collectively and are composed as continuously varying multiplicities, one sum. Leibniz derives his concept of substantial form from Aquinas, who argued that only form has the power to individuate, not matter. But he also generalizes Aquinas' notion of the mode of existence of angels, that of forms without matter, all the way to the souls of the lowest beings. Infima species. Following Descartes, however, he makes experience, feeling as constant activity concerning all modes of subjectivity, the principle of substantiality. For this reason, it seems that extension exists only as a sequence of representations of the mind. There is nothing in the world except simple substances, and in them perception and appetite, by which we move from one perception to the next, or again, since that what is not truly one being is not truly one being either. Follows the body is not real. Rather, it belongs to the domain of the possible. There is an infinity of possible modes, façons, that all matter could have received instead of the sequence of variations it actually received. If the subject becomes a superject decentered by its point of view, the object becomes a series of aspects, an ensemble of images. Each distinct body is an aggregation of aggregations ad infinitum, like a wave in an ocean of matter, conceived abstractly or incompletely. As a mode, it is an accidental unity among several monads, each of which possesses an essence that is not a mode. In Whitehead's terms, a body is a society of monads that has a duration but not necessarily actuality. Instead of the romantic conception of society as an organism, the Baroque conceived of the body itself as a society. Leibniz compares it to Theseus's ship, a structural object which has some ontological stability over time, despite undergoing constant alteration, repair, and renovation. Like a dynamic system that is permanently far from equilibrium, the body has no essence, but only a matter of composition. What constitutes the essence of a being by aggregation is only a mode of being, maniera d'etre, of the things of which it is composed.
This gets at what we were talking about with ocean regarding that it's not only what someone is doing, but how someone is doing it that
Mm.
constitutes the essence. So maybe if we're tying this to Moby Dick and we're looking at the Pequod, it's not enough to say that the Pequod is a whaling ship, so therefore we can determine its essence just by the fact that it's a whaling ship, but it's a whaling ship in which at one point all of the crew members decide to relentlessly pursue the white whale when their effective desires have been captured by the doubloon.
I get you.
Even if we look at the individual whalers on the ship, it's not enough to say that Ishmael is a whaler, so we know his essence by that. But you have to look at how he goes about whaling. So Ishmael is a contemplative whaler, and that's what determines his essence. Whereas Ahab is a vengeful whaler, and so on.
Yeah, the manner of doing.
Yeah.
Notwithstanding the inessentiality of bodies, Leibniz rarely subscribes to the idealist or phenomenalist conviction that the extended world exists only in monadic perception. And when he does, this happens from a strictly theoretical point of view, where demand for universal harmony among monadic essences is concerned. In practice, he argues, no soul except God's can exist without a body that connects it with the rest of the world. The body is precisely the point of view of the soul. The soul expresses its own body more clearly than the rest of the world because it expresses the world through its body. Each distinct simple substance or monad, which makes up the center of a composite substance, an animal, for example, and is the principle of its unity, is surrounded by a mass composed of an infinity of other monads, which constitute the body belonging to the central monad, through whose affections the monad represents the things outside it. Hence, in order for a phenomenon to be well-founded, it must not only be in harmony with the perceptions of other monads, there must also correspond to each of the soul's clear and distinct perceptions a composite organ, such that a perfect resemblance between internal perception and external bodies is guaranteed. The clear zone of expression of each monad remains insurmountably bound to an order of existence outside of itself, but in which perceptual subjectivity is objectively realized. Perceptive power merges with the expressive power of bodies. One of the central questions of all of Leibniz's metaphysical texts, therefore, concerns this Gordian knot by which each monad perceives the world with a perfect spontaneity as regards itself, and yet with a perfect conformity to things outside it. The knot is further complicated by the claims that God chose a certain world expressed by the individual souls that populate it, and that each monad, nonetheless, really draws its perceptions from the folds of its own infinite, obscure background. For it implies that if a soul is free to hallucinate about other possible worlds, it must have access to other perceptions than those chosen by God that also strive to exist. On the level of the actualization of the world, the level of divine justice or grace, Leibniz is compelled to exclude the reality of the possible, since what is at stake is precisely God's choice to bring this world into existence as it is expressed by individual souls. It is only on the level of realization in nature, where harmony depends on organic perspective, that Leibniz allows, either within the organic body or at least open to it, more reality than the soul can express by itself. Here, the potential composition of the infinitely divisible mass of monads is not restricted by God's choice for the actual world and encompasses all subsisting possible worlds. Aggregates such as clouds, rainbows, herds, crowds, and armies are hallucinations. Yet they do not exist any less because of that, even if they may be said to have a lesser degree of unity, since the process of realization does not bear on essence, but on modality. A material composition always expresses the potential of a monstrous multiplicity and unfolds other possible worlds within the present world. It is because the actual does not constitute the real, which must itself be realized in intermonadic relations which, quite unlike monadic essences, encompass all possible worlds, that Leibniz reverts to the artificial detour of pre-established harmony in the composition of the world. There is a universal harmony between monads, the mutual connection or accommodation of all created things to each other and of each to the rest, which causes each simple substance to have relations which express all the others, and consequently to be a perpetual living mirror of the universe. But this level of residence prevails only among souls, and does not suffice to guarantee that the order of souls and the order of bodies share the same universe. On the contrary, It is because harmony is already in place that monads cannot act on one another, and by implication on their bodies. Instead of the privacy of the soul, which is intime praesens, the body is always public, composed of partes extra partes. Since our body involves other individual monads, the question is rather how the soul can be immediately present in the body instead of the other way around. It is a question that concerns the nature and unity of composite or corporeal substances considered in themselves. Pre-established harmony demands that each material composite conforms to some principle of indirect mediation of the many by the one. It takes us from the internal connection of perceptions within the soul to external relations of belonging or dominance between substances, or as we already saw in Leibniz's Mannerist reinvention of subject-predicate logic, from being to having as universal fact. The core problem of metaphysics, no less than of theology, from Leibniz to Tarde and Whitehead, is how it is possible to say, my body, or more generally, how things can be present in one another without losing their unity or composition. If God let only the best of all possible worlds come into existence, not only must there be a public composite belonging to each private soul, but also a private soul to each public composite. We are in fact dealing with two modes of belonging: the body as collective means and the soul as individual end. So what founds the appurtenance of a single organism to each monad, despite a real distinction between actualization and realization? How can global harmony materialize in local union? When does having a body become being a body? According to Leibniz, the external world is made up of what the scholastics call secondary matter, materia secunda, or what Leibniz takes to be an infinitely divisible massa brutae. It consists of an unformed flux of monads, chaotically traversing all kinds of interactions and aggregations. Its indistinct collectivities correspond to the variability of the unconscious flux of perception within each monad. If the individual soul is nonetheless capable of extracting distinct perceptions from this insensible flux of perceptions, in the case of humans, even self-conscious apperceptions, this is because it is the owner of a primary matter, prima materia, a kind of passive power, elasticity, or antitopy, impenetrability, capable of uniting disparate individuals into the organism corresponding to its point of view. For Leibniz, the soul is the active power or form that dominates the composite substance, whereas the subordinate monads that participate in it are merely the requisites without which a thing cannot exist, that is, its subordinate material. However, it is important to remember that in Leibniz, since monads are emphatically incapable of influencing each other or exerting a force on one another, saying that one monad dominates others does not mean that the perceptions of the latter change under the influence of the former. This would only imply a phenomenal change and, moreover, conflict with the autarky of the monad in itself. Rather, it means that the dominant monad determines a collective situation or concerted action in which the clear zones of expression of separate monads come to stand in such a relation to each other that their common reason is expressed most clearly by the dominant monad. The difference between an organic aggregate and an anorganic aggregate is therefore that the former is made unum per se by a dominant soul that acts as foundation, fundamentum of the body, whereas the latter remains unum per accidens, and therefore cannot be regarded as substance. In fact, since secondary matter knows no intrinsic unity, it is not something real in itself. Matter is present only through the organic body that constitutes the perceptual apparatus of a dominant monad in which the well-founded phenomenon is concretized and otherwise remains fully abstract. At the same time, souls no longer appear as centers of material activity, but more like eddies of affectivity. For what is the trans individual composed of, if not acephalous animalities, that is, ameriological multiplicities?
If the harmony between individuals is reproduced at the level of the body, then this can only be on the condition of the strictest possible hierarchy of substances. For Leibniz, reasonable monads can never be dominated, since they are exempted from the mechanical laws of the lower level and coincide with the moral laws. But all the other souls, especially animal souls, are only dominant to a certain degree. This is because rather than substance being a placeholder for forces in which they inhere, for Leibniz, the relational concept of force constitutes substance. A reasonable monad relates to its body only as the primitive force, the primitive agendae, that corresponds to its primary matter. Animal monads, by contrast, are primitive forces only insofar as they are considered individually. Once they're taken en masse, something which, according to Leibniz, cannot happen with reasonable souls, they form clusters that imply a loss of individuality among their components. Secondary matter is therefore transversed by derivative forces, viri derivatae, that modify primitive forces and constitute the relative unity and activity of different kinds of non-individual multiplicities. Plugged into an infinity of material parts that do not form any part of its primary matter, each body is a power of metamorphosis. Both active and passive, it is a composite of primary and secondary forces, and as such remains open to an impersonal power of life beyond the solitude of the soul. As long as a distinction can be drawn between primitive forces and derivative forces, all forces can be said to reciprocally determine each other, but without the accumulation of derivative forces of the bodies belonging to each of the subordinate substances, the means, ever acting in a way that would be counternatural to primitive force, the end. What Leibniz aims at with his theory of pre-established harmony is the stabilization and moralization of forces, just also like he aims at the neutralization of possession. But how can I draw the line between my body and that of others when my body is a hybrid non-identity composed of infinities and autonomous individual monads, including animal, vegetal, and mineral ones, which in turn animate their own bodies, different from my organic body, of which they are only pro tempore requisites. In the fold, Deleuze makes a distinction between non-symmetric and inverted appurtenances of organization. My monad dominates the body, but each of the monads composing my body possesses its own composite of other monads, and constant or temporary appurtenances in flux. My body is of primary or limitation matter, but is composed of secondary or flux matter. Given the infinite divisibility of matter, however, such a distinction is never fully determinable. In the oscillation between the ontological order of souls and the phenomenal order of composition, sometimes the multiple becomes one, and sometimes the individuals become many. In fact, every individual is primary or secondary somewhere along the line of development of co-catalytic virtual conditions it expresses. Between the modes of existence and the corresponding material passages, we find a dynamic zone of indiscernibility as to what belongs to me and what doesn't. Hence the images of dizziness, stupefaction, and vertigo, l'étourdissement, frequently employed by Leibniz, or sleep in Spinoza, when he states that we do not know yet what a body can do, to describe what occurs in perception when derivative forces no longer act in subordination to primary forces. The well-foundedness of the phenomena is constantly put under pressure. What is merely a psychotic dream or fantasy, and what is real? Should I see a psychologist or a physiologist? Am I in control of my body, or are my belongings dispersed over conflicting property relations? Am I immediately present in my car and in control of its extended relations of production and exploitation, or am I astray by modes of production and consumption far beyond my control? Am I a cyborg, or am I a pig? It is in the immediately practical manner of these questions that abstract matter becomes concrete. While there is a whole casuistry to distinguishing property relations, it's imperative that real union can be proven, as the consequences of their confusion are dreadful. Schizophrenia, slavery, self-immolation, war, cannibalism, incest, necrophilia. Insofar as dominated monads conserve their individuality in respect to their own body, the dominant monad that appropriates them inversely relates to the bodies that belong to the monad it dominates. The natural order that is in no way individual is inseparable from the moral requirement to possess a body. If to each clear and distinct perception there corresponds some organic movement, this implies that phenomena must somehow be realized or reified in the tentacular relations of a material kinship that is irreducible to the genesis of the perceptions of the soul. The soul is the foundation of the body, but the body is the abysmal ground of the soul. Here, in the eternal recurrence of the problem to restore unity and dispersion, the provincial and dialectical, indeed secondary or derivative, character of Leibniz's system, his new materialism, reveals itself most fully. The ship of Theseus is a ship without a helmsman, or as he himself puts it, after I established these things, I thought I was entering a port, but when I began to mediate or meditate about the union of soul and body, I felt as if I were thrown again into the open sea.
Cartesian dualism came up in the last reading. That's like the mind-body split, and that's really what this is going on to. We have a biological substance, but we also have a psychical mode. We have a biological mode and a psychical mode.
I feel like this was also touching on the question Joby asked. That was something along the lines of, if the subject is constantly in flux, then how does it retain its unity? The thing that I really liked about this chapter is all the ocean metaphors and the ship metaphors, because what Sejord was saying about the ocean early on, each distinct body is an aggregation of aggregations ad infinitum, like a wave in an ocean of matter conceived abstractly or incompletely. It's like the notion of radical democracy by Whitman in Leaves of Grass, but applying it to an ocean environment instead of a field. So instead of saying that each individual blade of grass looks the same from the outside, but then you look closely at it, contains all this difference, and that massive difference creates a massive field. You say
Hmm.
that each drop of water that is massively different from every other, a drop of water that contains a whole ecosystem in itself and is different from every other drop of water that contains an ecosystem of itself, composes that vast, expansive ecosystem of the ocean. And there was this one writer that I came across recently who said something along the lines of the observer of a system is a system itself to be observed, which breaks that idea that you are an individual subject outside of a system looking at the system. Rather, you are a system within a system, and that there's only systems within systems. um,
Mm.
and that touches on what was discussed here.
I get where you're coming from in the sense where we often think at the front of our minds, but we cannot think about the thing behind the thought. A lot of the time, thought is self-terminating. This happens all the time in conversation when you are able to effortlessly speak without having to analyze where every word is coming from and how it's coming to you. You get the semblance of the sentence you want to say or the thing you want to share almost immediately or before you even start ushering it into words. But you're not stuck thinking of every individual word, you're just shoving them out there. And oftentimes, when things float up into self consciousness, I wouldn't go as far as to say we just assume that's where it all ends, but we do in action when we just speak or do things. There's a whole world of things that are shoved to the side. So I wonder if that's similar to what you were just saying now.
And in that mode, you're like a conduit. And I've often thought about it like you're a vessel pouring water, and the words just flow straight out of you. But in fact, a better way of thinking of it is as a conduit.
I like the idea. I do often feel very possessed. I feel like conduit is a great word.
That gets at Emily in Montreal in their book Technically Man Dwells Upon This Earth. I think they wrote Thought Thinks in Me. And it gets at this notion that you are not your thoughts, but you are the one who listens to your thoughts, which Emily in Montreal posted on Instagram. But
Mm.
recently, I've been trying to think of this metaphor of confusion that gets brought up with Sejord and other people when discussing Melville's Moby Dick. And so I looked up the definition of confused recently, and it's actually really interesting. The earlier definition of confused was like a pouring togetherness.
Like crossing the streams or something.
Yeah, you can think of it as like thousands of Amazonian rivers flowing into the ocean, as Melville would maybe say.
It's like a mixture.
That's what I was
Yeah.
thinking of it as. I was thinking of it like a paint
Yeah.
can where you're mixing paints.
You know the free refills machine they used to have in McDonald's where you could go up and put Coke, Fanta, Sprite.
Oh, you make your jungle juice.
Yeah, exactly. A mixture.
Humanity is a jungle juice of McDonald's, Coca-Cola, Sprite machine
It is.
choices.
It is. Yeah. Oh, there's another word I wanted to look at in there. What appurtenances is one.
That's it.
And there's another one that starts with A in there that should have a look at. Appurtenance is an accessory or other item associated with a particular activity or style of living. Or do they mean a manner of living? So, etymology, 14th century, from French, appurtenance, which comes from the Latin appertenere, to belong. It's mad. Whenever you look up a word, you'll find that the sense we use it in is related to, but is not exactly the original Latin. I don't know if you've ever done this before, but there's a great website, chambers.co.uk. It's another dictionary, one of the old originals like the Oxford Dictionary, but it always gives you the etymology as well. Sometimes when you look things up, it doesn't always tell you where the word came from. But I feel like you don't get the true sense of the word unless you know the origin of it.
Yeah, I feel that too. And actually, I'd say every single time I like the older use of the word more than how we use the word nowadays. But like with that word confused, you could see how its derivation from the mixture of con and I think it's like funder. Funder is pouring and con
Mm.
is with or together. And the way that we use confused now is basically a jumbling or mixing up of different thoughts. So the thoughts aren't all clearly unified. And in that way, it relates to that notion of mixing together or pouring together.
Mm.
But nowadays, it's more so restricted to like a mental space. Whereas previously, it didn't really pertain to like psychology so much.
Mm. It was things outside, but now we use it to mean things inside.
Yeah, but yeah, I think that words are these little narratives that can be unpacked and repacked. That's an idea that I'm taking from Professor Vlad Godzich. But taking from that a little bit, I don't think that we ever really lose the original definitions all that much. They might become weaker, but they're still present. So it is really important to learn the etymology of a
Learn Latin
word.
in school. This is one of those things I want to say they took this from you.
They took this.
This is
Yeah.
what they stole from you.
Make Latin great again.
Mm.
Oh, look at this.
um,
You missed, this is what they took from you. Latin in schools. We came onto this discussion because of when you have appurtenances, basically it meant like a thing belonging to someone was the original Latin connotation. But if you think about the word spectacle, it comes from the Latin spectaculum, from specere, meaning to look. So originally it meant to look, but now the spectacle is the thing you're looking at. So the word has been flipped in a way. And then also you have a pair of spectacles, which is something you look through.
Whoa.
But unless you knew the Latin of a lot of the words, it fucks you because you don't get the full meaning of it.
yeah, that reminds me of the reversal of the meaning materialist, where previously
Mm.
materialist dealt with a materialist conception of the world that the material relation gives rise to thought.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas nowadays, when people say, "Oh, you're so materialist," it means that you obsess over commodities. And there's a slight connection to the old definition, but it's it's been bastardized. And I think that a lot of times that's the case where our language has been heading is these bastardized versions where the revolutionary potential has been stripped in how we use language now.
Yeah.
But there's still always traces or marks from those previous definitions. They never totally go away. And I guess to tie this back to mannerism, we can talk about the development of language or the etymological development of language as being mannerist in terms that the old definitions simply become conditions for the new definitions.
And that last part of that little chapter, the ship of Theseus is a ship without a helmsman, then it brings you on to cybernetics and systems theory, where you think of all systems, law, government, environment, they're all separate systems that are autopoietic. They are connected incidentally when they bang into each other, when they affect each other, but they're not necessarily linked. There's just like a series of all of these circles looping over, bumping into each other or affecting each other, but each one is a self-perpetuating system. It isn't necessarily linked with all the others.
What that last part is making me think of now is Melville's narrative. So we have this quote here: "After I established these things, I thought I was entering the port. But when I began to meditate about the union of soul and body, I felt as if I were thrown again into the open sea." And in the beginning of Moby Dick, Ishmael says something like, "Water and meditation are wedded forever," which still escapes me in a lot of ways. Um, but by the end, Ishmael is left adrift at sea.
Well, think about this, the word meditate and Mediterranean.
Oh shit.
Which is a sea that people fucking gazed at and reflected upon. So meditate comes to us from the Latin 16th century meditare, to reflect upon.
There's that story of Narcissus too in the beginning. It might even be in the same chapter where Narcissus drowns in his own reflection in the water. There's a pouring together happening.
Also, medius meaning middle, terra meaning land, Mediterraneous, inland.
It's like a middle land. There might be a connection to Mannerism there as like an art of the middle, or in terms of secondness, or.
Well, it's literally Middle Earth. What, but why is it Middle Earth?
Because it's not the beginning or the end.
Oh, maybe it relates to like the division between land, water, and air in terms of different atmosphere.
Okay, so meditare means measure, meditate, contemplated.
Mael is the contemplative character, and he ends up adrift at sea.
Contemplate comes from the word temple, which is like another kind of meditation. It's so interesting that it's meditate, and Mediterranean. Before the word meditation, the Greek word theoria was used for the same purpose, according to Wikipedia, but there's no citation for that.
I really like that end part. Am I a cyborg or a pig?
Oh, only if you're a police officer. Fucking Robocop.
The secret third thing, a police officer.
Yeah. You see those guys walking around in like all that riot gear, they might as well be cyborgs.
Yeah. Yeah.